The bustling Los Angeles International Airport was as chaotic as ever, with travelers weaving through security lines and gates, clutching their tickets and bags as they hurried to their destinations. Among the throng of passengers was Thomas Whitaker, a middle-aged corporate executive who prided himself on his sharp suits, quick wit, and even quicker temper. He was on his way to New York for a critical business meeting and had splurged on a first-class ticket to ensure a comfortable journey. Little did he know, this flight would change his perspective forever. As Thomas settled into his plush seat in the first-class cabin, he glanced around, assessing the other passengers. Most were dressed in designer suits or casual luxury, exuding an air of wealth and status that matched his own. Except for one man. Seated across the aisle, an elderly gentleman in a weathered leather jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots sat quietly, flipping through a paperback book. His grey hair was tousled, and his face bore the deep lines of age and experience. Thomas couldn't help but sneer internally. First class sure isn't what it used to be, he thought, shaking his head. He leaned over to his seatmate, a young tech entrepreneur, and whispered, "Looks like they'll let anyone in here these days." The entrepreneur chuckled nervously, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict Thomas. Meanwhile, the elderly man seemed unfazed, his eyes focused on his book. As the flight attendants began their pre-flight announcements, Thomas couldn't resist making a jab. He leaned across the aisle and said loudly, "Excuse me, sir, but are you sure you're in the right cabin? This is first class, not economy." The elderly man looked up slowly, his piercing blue eyes meeting Thomas's with a calm, steady gaze. He smiled faintly and replied, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Thank you for your concern." His tone was polite but firm, and his response only irritated Thomas further. "Well, you don't exactly look the part," Thomas muttered, loud enough for others to hear. A few passengers glanced over, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The man didn't respond. Instead, he returned to his book, seemingly unfazed by Thomas's rude remark. This only fueled Thomas's annoyance. How dare this man ignore him? As the flight leveled off at cruising altitude, Thomas decided he'd had enough of the silent dismissal. Fueled by a glass of expensive champagne and his own inflated ego, he leaned across the aisle again. "You know, respect is earned. Maybe if you dress the part, people wouldn't mistake you for someone who's lost their way." The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet. A flight attendant passing by hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. The elderly man sighed, closed his book, and turned to face Thomas fully. "And perhaps," he said calmly, "respect is also about how you treat others, not just how you perceive them." The response drew a few murmurs of approval from other passengers. Thomas's face reddened, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Oh, is that so? And what exactly do you do that makes you such an authority on respect?" The man hesitated for a moment, then said simply, "I'm retired." Thomas scoffed. "Figures. Probably spent your life doing what? Manual labor? Construction? Ranch work?" Before the man could respond, another passenger interjected. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp, "but do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Thomas turned toward the woman, a middle-aged lady seated a few rows behind. She looked incredulous, almost angry. "That," she said, pointing to the elderly man, "is Clint Eastwood." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Thomas blinked, stunned. "Clint Eastwood?" he repeated, his voice shaky. He turned back to the man, who now wore a faint, amused smile. "The one and only," the woman continued. "Director, actor, producer, cultural icon. Ever heard of him?" The color drained from Thomas's face as realization set in. He had been insulting a living legend, a man whose contributions to cinema and culture were immeasurable. I didn't recognize you," Thomas stammered, his bravado crumbling. I'm a big fan of your work." Really, I am. Clint Eastwood chuckled softly. Don't worry about it, he said, his tone forgiving. But maybe next time, think twice before judging someone based on their appearance. For the remainder of the flight, Thomas was uncharacteristically quiet. He avoided eye contact with Clint and refrained from making any more snide comments. The other passengers, however, seemed to rally around Clint, engaging him in conversations about his films, his favorite roles, and his experiences in Hollywood. Clint, ever gracious, entertained their questions with humor and humility. By the time the plane landed in New York, Thomas felt like a shadow of his former self. As the passengers disembarked, he hesitated, then turned to Clint one last time. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice low. "I'm sorry for what I said. It was out of line." Clint nodded, his expression kind. "Apology accepted. Take care of yourself." As Thomas walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had learned a valuable lesson, one about humility, respect, and the dangers of making snap judgments. And though he would never admit it aloud, he knew he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood strolled through the airport terminal, his weathered leather jacket slung over his shoulder, a faint smile playing on his lips. For him, it was just another day. But for Thomas, it was a day he would never forget. As Thomas sat in his seat after the confrontation, he couldn't help but feel a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. The name Clint Eastwood echoed in his mind, dredging up memories of watching classic westerns with his father as a child. He remembered the larger-than-life characters Eastwood portrayed, men of principle and grit. How had he not recognized the man himself? Thomas decided to do a little damage control. He called over the flight attendant and ordered another glass of champagne. When she returned, he leaned in and asked, "Has Mr. Eastwood flown with you before?" The attendant smiled. "Oh, yes. He's a frequent flyer. Always flies first class, but never makes a fuss. He's one of the kindest passengers we've ever had." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The more he learned about Clint, the worse he felt about his earlier behavior. He glanced over and saw Clint engaged in a quiet conversation with the woman who had defended him. They were laughing about something, and Thomas felt a pang of envy. It seemed Clint had an effortless way of connecting with people, a trait Thomas realized he lacked. Clint Eastwood, for his part, remained unbothered by the incident. As a man who had spent decades in the public eye, he was no stranger to being underestimated or judged. But he had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words. His calm demeanor wasn't just a product of age, it was a philosophy he had cultivated over years of navigating the highs and lows of Hollywood. During the flight, Clint shared stories with other passengers about his experiences directing films, his love of jazz music, and even his favorite hiking trails. He spoke with humility, never boasting about his achievements, even when pressed. His stories painted a picture of a man who had lived a full, adventurous life, but remained grounded. One passenger asked, "What's the secret to your success?" Clint smiled. "Hard work and treating people with respect," he said simply. And never forgetting where you came from after the flight, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about Clint's words. The encounter had been a wake-up call, forcing him to confront his own arrogance and prejudices. For years, he had measured people's worth by their appearance or status, never pausing to consider the stories behind their faces. But now, he saw things differently. Back at his hotel, Thomas found himself researching Clint Eastwood's career. He watched interviews, read articles, and even ordered a few of Clint's films to stream. With each piece of information, his admiration for the man grew. He began to see Clint not just as a movie star, but as a role model, someone who embodied the values Thomas realized he had lost sight of. The weeks that followed, Thomas made a conscious effort to change. He started listening more and judging less. At work, he treated his colleagues with newfound respect.